Have you ever heard the word stagflation? It sounds like something out of a sci-fi movie, a weird economic monster. But in the 1970s, this monster was very real, and it turned the world upside down. Imagine this. Prices for everything are soaring, so your money buys less and less each day. At the same time, businesses are laying people off, and finding a job is nearly impossible. Inflation and high unemployment happening together. Economists thought this was impossible. It was like trying to freeze and boil water at the same time. But it happened, and it plunged the global economy into a decade of crisis. Today, we're going to unravel the real story behind the great stagflation of the 1970s. It's a tale of oil, war, and economic theories being shattered. Stick around, because understanding this piece of history is more relevant today than you might think. To really get what happened, we need to rewind a bit, back to the golden age after World War II. From the 1950s to the late 60s, economies in the West, especially the United States, were booming. Jobs were plentiful, wages were rising, and people felt optimistic. This was the era of the American dream in full swing. The dominant economic idea at the time was the Phillips curve. It's a simple concept. When unemployment is low, inflation tends to be high, and when unemployment is high, inflation tends to be low. It's a trade-off. Governments believed they could fine-tune the economy, choosing a little more inflation to get a little less unemployment, or vice versa. For a while, it seemed to work perfectly. The economy was like a well-behaved machine that policymakers could control with a few simple levers. But beneath the surface, the seeds of the coming crisis were already being sown. One of the first major cracks in this perfect picture came from government spending. The 1960s saw the launch of President Lyndon B. Johnson's Great Society programs. These were ambitious social initiatives aimed at eliminating poverty and racial injustice. At the same time, the United States was getting deeper and deeper into the Vietnam War. Both of these things cost an enormous amount of money. The government was essentially trying to pay for guns and butter at the same time, without raising taxes enough to cover the costs. To finance this, they printed more money. When you pump more money into the economy, without a corresponding increase in goods and services, what happens? Prices start to rise. This was the beginning of the inflationary pressure that would later explode. The economic engine was starting to overheat, but most people didn't notice the warning signs just yet. Then came the first major shock, the one that truly lit the fuse. It had to do with something the modern world cannot live without: oil. For decades, the West had enjoyed access to cheap and abundant oil from the Middle East. But in 1973, everything changed. In response to the United States' support for Israel during the Yom Kippur War, the Organization of Arab Petroleum Exporting Countries, or OAPEC, declared an oil embargo. They cut off oil supplies to the U.S. and its allies. The impact was immediate and devastating. The price of a barrel of oil quadrupled almost overnight. Think about that. The cost of the single most important commodity in the world shot up by 400%. This wasn't just about paying more at the gas pump. Oil is in everything. It's used for transportation, for manufacturing plastics, for heating homes, for producing electricity. So when the price of oil skyrocketed, the cost of producing almost everything else went up with it. This is what economists call a supply shock. It's different from the government just printing too much money. This was a physical constraint on the economy's ability to produce goods. Businesses faced a massive increase in their costs. To stay afloat, they had two choices: either raise their prices significantly, passing the cost on to consumers, or cut back on production and lay off workers. They ended up doing both. So now you had prices for everyday goods soaring, which is inflation. At the same time, companies were firing people, which is rising unemployment. The Phillips curve, that neat little trade-off economists believed in, was completely broken. You had the worst of both worlds. Stagflation was born. The economic monster had arrived. The situation created a vicious cycle. As prices rose, workers demanded higher wages to keep up with the cost of living. Unions negotiated for cost of living adjustments, which were automatically built into their contracts. This made sense for the workers, but for businesses, it just meant another increase in their costs. So, they had to raise prices even more to cover the higher wages. This is called a wage-price spiral. Wages go up, so prices go up, which means wages need to go up again and on it goes.
Right.
Inflation wasn't just a temporary blip anymore. It became embedded in people's expectations. Everyone just assumed prices would keep rising, so they acted accordingly, which in turn made the inflation worse. The government and the central bank, the Federal Reserve, were trapped. They didn't know how to fight this new enemy. Think about their dilemma. Traditional economic policy said that to fight inflation, you should raise interest rates and reduce government spending. This cools down the economy, but the economy was already cool. In fact, it was shrinking and people were losing their jobs. So, if they tried to fight inflation the old way, they risked making the unemployment situation a complete catastrophe. On the other hand, if they tried to fight unemployment by lowering interest rates and increasing spending to stimulate the economy, they would just pour more fuel on the inflationary fire. It was a catch-22. Presidents like Nixon, Ford, and Carter all struggled with this. They tried price controls, which were a disaster. They tried public campaigns asking people to voluntarily stop raising prices. Nothing seemed to work. The public's confidence in their leaders and in the economy plummeted. The optimistic mood of the post-war era was gone, replaced by a sense of pessimism and uncertainty that was nicknamed malaise. The stagflation crisis didn't just stay in the United States. It was a global phenomenon. Europe and Japan, also heavily dependent on imported oil, were hit just as hard, if not harder. The crisis triggered a fundamental rethinking of economics. The old Keynesian ideas, which focused on managing demand, had failed to explain or solve stagflation. A new school of thought, led by economists like Milton Friedman, gained prominence. They argued that the focus should be on controlling the money supply and that governments should play a much smaller role in the economy. They believed that trying to fine-tune the economy was a fool's errand and often made things worse. This shift in thinking would have profound consequences for economic policy in the decades to come.
Owl.
So how did it finally end? The answer is, with some very painful medicine. In 1979, a new chairman of the Federal Reserve was appointed, a man named Paul Volcker. Volcker was determined to break the back of inflation no matter the cost. He believed that the only way to stop the wage-price spiral was to shock the system. He raised interest rates to unprecedented levels, at one point pushing the key federal funds rate to a staggering 20%. To put that in perspective, a normal rate is usually somewhere between 2 and 5%. The effect of this Volcker shock was brutal. It became incredibly expensive for businesses and consumers to borrow money. The economy was deliberately plunged into a deep recession in the early 1980s. Unemployment soared to over 10%, the highest level since the Great Depression. It was a tough, painful period. People lost their jobs, their homes, their businesses, but Volcker held his ground, and eventually it worked. The severe recession finally broke the inflationary psychology. With the economy in a deep freeze, the pressure for higher wages and prices finally subsided. By the mid-1980s, inflation had been tamed, falling from double digits down to a more manageable 4%. Once inflation was under control, the economy could finally begin a real, sustainable recovery. The policies of President Ronald Reagan, which included tax cuts and deregulation, also played a role in the subsequent economic boom. Building on the stable foundation that Volcker's painful but necessary actions had created, the stagflation of the 1970s was a defining economic event of the 20th century. It taught us that economic certainties can be shattered, that the global economy is deeply interconnected, and that the relationship between inflation and unemployment is far more complex than we once thought. It showed how external shocks, like an oil crisis, can completely derail even the strongest economies. And it serves as a powerful reminder of the painful choices policymakers sometimes have to make to ensure long-term stability. The next time you hear politicians or economists talking about the risk of stagflation, you'll know exactly what they mean. It's not just a technical term. It's a piece of history with real painful lessons about the delicate balance of our economic world. Thanks for watching, and if you found this deep dive interesting, be sure to like this video and subscribe for more stories from history.